My name is Ethan Hayes, and I'm 27 years old. What happened at my sister's wedding didn't just destroy our family. It shook our entire business community. Imagine this. Nearly 300 guests packed into a lavish ballroom. Music playing, glasses raised, smiles everywhere. And then my mother deliberately poured expensive red wine all over my suit and hit me so hard I froze. Why? Because I refused to hand over the keys to my $2 million penthouse during the reception. Right there, in front of everyone. But that wasn't even the worst part. An hour later, something no one expected happened. The CEO of one of the most powerful investment firms in the city walked straight into the ballroom. My mother saw his face and screamed so loud people heard it 3 floors away. He wasn't just a guest. He owned 40% of my father's company, and he had just watched everything happen live. Before I tell you what he said, and how one phone call turned their perfect wedding into a public disaster, take a moment to like and subscribe, but only if you enjoy stories about standing up for yourself. Tell me where you're watching from and what time it is there. Now let me take you back to the morning I thought I was just attending my little sister's dream wedding. I arrived at the hotel early that morning thinking this would be simple. Show up, smile, sit through the ceremony, clap at the right moments, then disappear quietly the way I always did at family events. The ballroom was already buzzing when I walked in, staff adjusting centerpieces, planners arguing in hushed voices, photographers testing angles like this wedding was a movie set, and in a way it was, just not the kind anyone expected. My sister looked thrilled, floating between bridesmaids like she owned the world. My parents were already in host mode, greeting guests like royalty. And the moment my mother spotted me, her smile tightened just enough for me to notice. She didn't say good morning. She didn't ask how I was. She looked at my suit and said flatly, "You look expensive today," which coming from her wasn't a compliment. It was a warning. I'd paid for half of this wedding without anyone knowing, quietly wiring money when my father complained about costs, upgrading things when my sister said she dreamed bigger. But like always, I kept my mouth shut because in this family, money was only acknowledged when it came from my parents. Anything I did was expected, invisible, taken for granted. As the morning went on, the comments started piling up, aunts asking when I planned to settle down, uncles joking about how I worked too much, cousins asking if I was still renting, all of them assuming things about my life without ever asking. And I let it slide the way I always did because today wasn't about me. The ceremony itself was flawless, music echoing, guests emotional, my sister crying happy tears, my parents beaming like they'd personally designed the universe, and I clapped along feeling like a background prop in a production I'd helped finance but would never get credit for. It wasn't until the reception started that things shifted. Speeches began, champagne flowed, my father stood up glowing with pride and started talking about family, about sacrifice, about how much they'd done for their children. And that's when I felt it, that familiar tightening in my chest that told me something was coming. He started praising my sister, her kindness, her future, her marriage, then casually mentioned how family supports family and how generosity defines character, and I watched my mother turn toward me with that look she always had when she thought she was about to win. She stood, took the microphone from him without asking, smiled at the crowd, and said something about wedding gifts, about how meaningful it is when siblings step up. And then she said my name. Loud, clear, public. She announced that I would be giving my penthouse to my sister as a wedding gift because she deserved a beautiful start to her new life, and because I didn't really need all that space anyway. For a second, I honestly thought I misheard her. My brain refused to process it. The room erupted in applause before I could even react. People smiling at me like I'd just done something noble, and I felt trapped, cornered by sound and expectation and hundreds of eyes. My mother leaned in and whispered, "Just smile and hand over the keys. Don't embarrass us." And that was the moment something finally snapped. I stood up slowly, heart pounding, hands steady, and said no. Just no. Not yelling, not explaining, just no. The applause died instantly, confusion rippling through the room. My father froze mid-smile. My sister's face shifted from joy to shock, and my mother's expression hardened into something ugly. She hissed at me that I was selfish, that this wasn't the time, that family comes first, and I said calmly, "This is my property, and I'm not giving it away." That's when she lost control. She grabbed a glass of red wine from a passing tray, dumped it straight down the front of my suit, and before I could even step back, she hit me. Hard. Open hand. Full force. The sound echoed. People gasped. Someone screamed. I stood there stunned, suit ruined, face burning, watching my mother breathe heavily like she'd just done something justified. No one moved. No one stopped her. That silence told me everything I needed to know. I didn't shout. I didn't argue. I didn't defend myself. I turned, walked straight out of the ballroom, and felt 100 conversations explode behind me the second the doors closed. I went outside, hands shaking now, pulled my phone out, and made one call. Just one. I didn't explain. I didn't rant. I said it happened. It's public. It's live, and I need you here. The answer was simple. I'm on my way. I sat in my car for a moment staring at my reflection in the window, wine stains, red mark on my face, and instead of feeling embarrassed, I felt calm, like the decision had already been made for me. I didn't know exactly how it would play out, but I knew this much. I wasn't going back in there to apologize. I wasn't handing over anything, and for the first time in my life, I wasn't going to protect them from the consequences of their own actions. Inside that ballroom, they were still celebrating, still assuming I'd fold, still convinced I was the problem, and they had no idea that in less than an hour the balance of power in that room was about to shift completely. I stayed in the car longer than I expected, not because I was hesitating, but because for the first time in my life no one was telling me what to do next. My phone buzzed nonstop, my sister calling, my father calling, even a few unknown numbers, probably relatives trying to pull me back inside, but I didn't answer any of them. I watched guests through the glass doors laughing awkwardly, pretending nothing had happened, because that's what people do when something ugly breaks the illusion of a perfect event. They rush to glue it back together before it reflects on them. I finally stepped out, straightened what was left of my jacket, and walked to the hotel bar where I ordered water and sat with my back to the ballroom, listening to muffled music and applause like it belonged to another world. 10 minutes passed, then 20, then 30, and with every minute that went by my parents' confidence inside that room was quietly draining even if they didn't know it yet. I could picture my mother pacing, furious that I hadn't come back begging, my father trying to regain control by laughing too loudly, my sister stuck between anger and embarrassment because the spotlight had slipped. Around the 40-minute mark my phone buzzed again, but this time it wasn't family, it was a single text that just said arriving now. I took a slow breath because that was the moment things stopped being emotional and started being structural. When the ballroom doors opened again, the energy shifted instantly. You can feel it when power walks into a room, even if people don't know why yet. Conversations stalled, heads turned, and I saw my father's posture change before I even saw who it was. A tall man in a dark suit stepped in with two others behind him, calm, unhurried, scanning the room like he owned it, because in many ways he did. He didn't look angry. He didn't look rushed. He looked disappointed, which somehow felt worse. My mother noticed him a second later, and that's when the scream happened, sharp and uncontrolled, cutting through the music so hard the band stopped mid-note. People stared, phones came out, whispers exploded, and the man didn't react at all. He just kept walking until he reached the head table where my parents stood frozen like statues who had finally realized the audience wasn't on their side anymore. He didn't raise his voice, didn't need a microphone, but somehow everyone heard him when he said my name and asked if I was present. Every head turned toward me at the bar, and for the first time that day, I didn't feel small under the attention. I stood, walked back into the ballroom, and the path people cleared for me felt completely different from before. No judgment, just curiosity mixed with fear. He explained calmly who he was, what percentage of my father's company he controlled, and what he had just witnessed on a live broadcast that had already spread beyond that room. My father tried to speak, tried to laugh it off, but the man cut him off without raising his voice and said something that silenced everyone. That public behavior reflects leadership, and leadership like this is a liability. My mother tried to interrupt, tried to reframe it as a family misunderstanding, and he turned to her and said assault and coercion are not misunderstandings, especially when they involve assets tied to corporate agreements. I watched my sister's face drain of color as the reality set in that this wasn't just about a penthouse anymore. This was about control they thought they had and never actually did. My father started sweating, literally, adjusting his tie like it might save him, while guests began quietly leaving their tables pretending they needed air or phone calls. The man looked at me then and asked a simple question. Did you agree to transfer your property? I said no, clearly, calmly, and that was all he needed. He announced that any attempt to force such a transfer constituted a breach of conduct clauses tied to executive partnerships, and that the board would be reviewing the incident immediately. You could feel the room tilt, not physically, but socially, like gravity had shifted and no one knew where to stand anymore. My mother tried one last time to speak, to shame me, to remind everyone that I was her son and family should be handled privately. And that's when he said something that ended it all. That family does not excuse criminal behavior, and private abuse does not stay private when it becomes public spectacle. No one applauded. No one cheered. The silence was heavier than any reaction could have been. I didn't stay after that. I didn't need to. I walked out again, this time without shaking, without looking back, knowing that inside that ballroom deals were already unraveling, reputations were already cracking, and my parents were realizing too late that the power they'd used against me for years only worked when I stayed quiet. That night didn't end with shouting or reconciliation or dramatic apologies. It ended with doors closing, phones ringing unanswered, and a truth finally taking up space they could no longer ignore. I went home that night instead of answering any calls, not because I was avoiding the fallout, but because I knew whatever happened next would happen without my input, and for once that was exactly how it needed to be. I took a shower and watched red wine swirl down the drain along with years of swallowing things I should have never accepted, my phone lighting up nonstop on the counter while I let it ring until it stopped meaning anything. By the time I checked it, there were dozens of messages, my sister crying that I ruined her wedding, my father demanding we talk immediately, my mother sending one-line texts swinging between rage and guilt, and then messages from people I hadn't expected at all, business contacts, acquaintances, even one client asking if I was okay and saying they had just seen something disturbing online. That was when I realized the live stream hadn't just stayed inside that ballroom. It had escaped, and once it did, there was no pulling it back. The next morning, the consequences started stacking fast, and not in ways my parents could control. I woke up to a voicemail from my father that sounded nothing like the man I grew up with, his voice shaky, rushed, saying there had been misunderstandings and that we needed to get ahead of this before it damaged things permanently. I didn't call him back. Instead, I opened my laptop and saw the clip already circulating, headlines forming without anyone needing to exaggerate. Wedding turns hostile as parents publicly pressure son to surrender property. Investment partner intervenes after witnessing live incident. I watched the video once and then closed it because I didn't need to relive it to know the truth was finally out where they couldn't rewrite it. By midday, my sister's wedding had officially stopped being about her marriage and started being about damage control. Guests were talking, photos were being shared. People who had clapped earlier were now asking uncomfortable questions, and the same relatives who told me to be reasonable were suddenly quiet. My sister sent a long message saying she never asked for the penthouse and that I embarrassed her in front of everyone, conveniently skipping over the part where she stood silent while our mother assaulted me. I replied once and only once saying this never should have been public, but none of it was my choice, and then I muted the thread. What surprised me most was how fast the business side reacted, because that's where emotion doesn't get the benefit of the doubt. My father's company started receiving calls asking for clarification, not accusations, just polite concern, which is always worse. People don't confront when they're deciding whether to distance themselves, they observe. By afternoon, one of his long-standing partners postponed a meeting citing optics. Another asked for written assurances about governance standards, and the word liability started appearing in conversations that had nothing to do with family. That evening, the man who walked into the ballroom called me directly and asked if I was holding up. He didn't lecture, didn't dramatize. He just said something simple that stuck with me. That people reveal who they are when they believe they have leverage, and that my parents believed they had it over me because I'd always allowed it. He told me the board review was moving forward not as a threat, but as a responsibility, and that regardless of what happened, I wasn't alone in it. That mattered more than I expected. Meanwhile, my parents were spiraling. My father sent message after message asking me to help fix this, to explain, to soften things, as if I could undo years of behavior with a statement. My mother didn't apologize. She reframed, telling relatives I had been stressed, that I misunderstood, that families fight and people overreacted. But the problem was the footage didn't lie, and no amount of narrative could make a raised hand disappear. People don't forget what they see clearly. By the second day, my sister stopped calling altogether, and I heard through someone else that her in-laws were reconsidering things not out of cruelty, but concern, asking questions about what kind of environment they were joining and whether this behavior was isolated or a pattern. That was when it finally clicked for me that this wasn't just about me standing up for myself. It was about a system that had worked for my parents because no one challenged it until it became impossible to ignore. I didn't celebrate any of it. I didn't feel victorious. I felt steady. For the first time, I wasn't bracing for the next demand or the next guilt trip or the next expectation that I sacrifice something quietly. Whatever came next would be built on truth instead of pressure, and that alone made it worth walking away from a room full of people who only valued me when I stayed small. The fourth day after the wedding was when I realized the damage had moved beyond my family and into territory they couldn't manage with charm or money. Up until then, my parents still believed this was a storm they could wait out, a bad headline cycle, a misunderstanding that would fade once people got distracted by the next scandal. That belief disappeared the moment my father's assistant called him instead of the other way around. Assistants don't call first unless something is already wrong. I didn't hear it directly, but I heard enough. One of my father's largest institutional partners had requested an emergency call, not to accuse, not to threaten, just to ask whether the behavior at the wedding reflected how disputes were handled internally. That single question did more damage than any angry demand ever could. My father had spent decades building an image of stability, predictability, control. Seeing him reduced to explaining a slap caught on camera to people who controlled millions of dollars was something I never thought I'd witness. By midday, another partner paused funding tied to a future expansion. Not canceled. Paused. That word sounds harmless until you realize it freezes momentum. Deals don't die loudly. They stall. And stalled deals create panic. My father called me again, not with anger this time, but with urgency that bordered on fear. He said we needed to talk now, that lawyers were involved, that the board wanted answers, that I had to help him explain what happened. I asked him a question I'd never asked before. I asked why it was my responsibility. He didn't have an answer. My mother went a different route. She started reaching out to people quietly, framing herself as a concerned parent dealing with a difficult child. She told them I'd always been sensitive, that I'd taken things the wrong way, that the wedding stress got to everyone. But the problem with that approach was simple. Sensitive people don't usually have bruises. Sensitive people don't get hit on camera. The version of events she was selling couldn't survive reality. That afternoon, a friend sent me something that made my stomach drop. Someone had clipped the video and slowed it down. You could see my mother's face clearly. You could see the wine being poured intentionally, not spilled. You could see the moment before the slap, the anger, the decision. It wasn't ambiguous. It wasn't heated misunderstanding. It was deliberate. That clip spread faster than the original. Context stopped matching. What shocked me most wasn't the comments from strangers. It was the messages from extended family. People who'd been silent for years suddenly found their voices. A cousin apologized for laughing along with jokes at my expense. An aunt admitted she always thought something was wrong, but never said anything. Even my grandmother sent a short message saying no one had the right to treat me that way, no matter the circumstances. Those messages didn't erase the past, but they reframed it. I wasn't imagining things. I never had been. My sister finally reached out again that evening. Her message was long and messy and full of blame mixed with confusion. She said her in-laws were furious, that the wedding photos were useless now, that people wouldn't stop talking, that she felt like everything had been stolen from her. I read it twice before responding. I told her calmly that nothing had been stolen, that what happened was exposed, and those were very different things. I told her I was sorry her day turned into chaos, but I wasn't sorry I said no. She didn't reply. That night, I sat alone in my penthouse for the first time since the incident and really took in where I was. The city lights stretched out below me, quiet and steady, indifferent to family drama and social collapse. This place had always been a symbol of independence for me, something I'd built without help, without shortcuts. Now it felt like something else too, proof that I could stand my ground and survive the consequences. The next morning, the business community made its position clear without issuing a single public statement. Meetings were postponed. Invitations disappeared. Calls went unanswered. When my father tried to push back, to assert authority, he found himself talking into silence. Power only works when people believe in it. The moment they question your judgment, it evaporates. Marcus called me late that day and told me the board review had expanded, not because of pressure from me, but because of pressure from outside stakeholders. He said several members were concerned not just about the incident, but about what it revealed regarding internal culture. He asked if I wanted to make a formal statement. I told him no. I said the facts were already public, and anything I said would only give my parents something to argue against. Silence, in this case, was stronger. He agreed. By the end of the week, my father finally understood something he'd refused to see for years. This wasn't a family dispute that could be smoothed over behind closed doors. This was a public demonstration of how he allowed power to be abused in his own household. And if he couldn't control that, people were no longer confident he could control a company. He sent me a message that night that said simply, "I didn't think it would go this far." I stared at it for a long time before replying. I told him it only went as far as it was allowed to go, and that I'd stopped allowing it. That was the last message we exchanged for a while. What came next wasn't revenge. It wasn't even justice in the way people like to imagine it. It was consequence unfolding naturally, without my involvement, without my interference. And watching that happen taught me something important. Standing up for yourself doesn't always look dramatic. Sometimes it looks like stepping aside and letting the truth do the damage on its own. By the time the weekend arrived, the situation had evolved into something none of us could undo. Not because of anger or spite, but because too many people had now seen too much, and once that happens, control slips away permanently. My father stopped calling altogether, which told me more than any voicemail ever could, because silence was his last defense when authority failed. My mother, on the other hand, doubled down in private conversations, telling anyone who would listen that she was being punished for raising an ungrateful son, that modern values had poisoned loyalty, that success had turned me cold. But the problem was those words landed on people who had watched the footage themselves, and no amount of parental framing could erase the image of a grown woman striking her child in public. What really shifted things was when my father's board scheduled an internal review without his approval. That doesn't happen unless confidence is already gone. I learned about it indirectly through Marcus, who didn't dramatize it or soften it. He just stated facts the way leaders do when they know the outcome is no longer emotional. He said several members wanted clarity on governance, ethics, and personal conduct, and that the wedding incident had raised concerns they could no longer ignore. He also said something that stayed with me, that boards rarely act because of one event, they act because an event confirms what people already suspected. At the same time, my personal life went strangely quiet. Friends checked in once, offered support, then let me be, which was exactly what I needed. No one asked me to explain myself. No one suggested reconciliation. They treated the situation like adults treat boundaries, with respect. That contrast alone showed me how abnormal my family dynamic had always been. I wasn't difficult. I wasn't dramatic. I had simply been surrounded by people who benefited from my silence. My sister eventually sent another message, shorter this time, stripped of emotion and accusation, saying she didn't understand how things had spiraled so fast, and that she felt like she was paying the price for something she didn't create. I didn't argue with her. I didn't defend myself. I told her the truth as calmly as I could, that systems don't collapse because of one moment. They collapse because pressure has been building for years and something finally exposes it. She read it and didn't respond. I knew then that whatever relationship we might have in the future would have to be built from scratch or not at all. What surprised me most during that week was how often people reached out to say they'd experienced something similar, not the whine or the slap, but the entitlement, the assumption that success belonged to the family rather than the individual, the idea that love meant access and obedience. Executives, friends, even a few people I barely knew told me stories of being pressured, minimized, or used until they finally said no. Hearing that made it clear this wasn't just my story. It was a pattern people rarely talk about, because challenging family narratives feels dangerous until it becomes necessary. Toward the end of the week, Marcus asked if I was prepared for the possibility that my father might lose his position if the board decided the risk was too great. He didn't frame it as a threat, just a realistic outcome. I told him I wasn't pushing for that, and never had been. He said he knew, and that ironically my restraint was what made my position stronger, because it showed I wasn't acting emotionally or vindicatively. That was the moment I realized I didn't need to prove anything to anyone anymore. The truth had weight on its own. When Sunday night came, I stood by the windows of my penthouse watching the city move the way it always did, indifferent, unstoppable, and I felt something settle inside me that I'd never felt before, certainty without tension. Whatever happened next would happen whether I intervened or not, and for the first time that didn't scare me. I had my boundaries, my work, my independence, and my peace, and nothing they said or did could take that back. The wedding had ended days ago, but the consequences were only beginning, and I knew the next phase wouldn't be loud or dramatic. It would be quiet and final, the kind of shift that changes everything without asking permission. By the following week, the narrative had completely escaped my parents' control, and what replaced it was far worse than public outrage, because outrage burns out, but loss of credibility doesn't. My father finally called again, not to argue or demand, but to ask if we could meet privately, and that alone told me how far things had shifted, because for most of my life, private meetings only happened after I'd already been cornered publicly. I didn't agree right away, and that hesitation seemed to unsettle him more than my refusal ever could. When we did meet, it wasn't at the house or at his office, but in a neutral conference room downtown. And when he walked in, he didn't look angry or confident or authoritative. He looked smaller, like someone who had spent a week realizing that the image he relied on no longer protected him. He started talking, immediately filling the silence with explanations about stress and optics and how things had spiraled faster than he expected, and I let him talk, because for once I wasn't trying to fix anything. When he finally paused, I asked him a question I'd never asked before, and I asked it calmly: why he believed he had the right to announce my property as a gift without asking me, and the room went quiet in a way that felt heavier than shouting ever could. He tried to justify it by saying family shares resources, and that my success benefited everyone, and I told him that sharing implies consent, not coercion, and that success doesn't erase ownership. He didn't argue after that, he just looked tired. What followed wasn't an apology, not really, but something closer to resignation. He admitted that he'd grown used to the idea that my achievements were expandable, that they could be redistributed to smooth over other people's lives, because I'd never fought back before. Hearing that said out loud was oddly clarifying, because it confirmed what I'd always felt but never had words for. I told him I wasn't there to negotiate or reconcile, and that this meeting wasn't about repairing our relationship. It was about setting a boundary so clear it couldn't be misinterpreted again. I told him the penthouse was not a topic of discussion now or ever, and that any attempt to involve my assets and family matters would be met with legal response, not conversation. He nodded slowly, like someone memorizing terms they couldn't afford to break. While that was happening, the board review continued without pause, and by midweek the outcome was obvious even before it was announced. My father wasn't removed outright, but his authority was significantly reduced. Oversight increased, approvals required, decisions delayed, and for someone like him, that was almost worse than being fired, because it meant existing under scrutiny rather than command. Clients noticed immediately, and uncertainty spreads fast in environments built on confidence. Contracts weren't canceled en masse, but they were renegotiated, postponed, downsized, and that slow bleed did more damage than a single dramatic loss ever could. My mother reacted differently to the shift, because she'd always believed control came from narrative rather than structure, and when the narrative failed, she lashed out. She left me a voicemail accusing me of betrayal, of choosing money over family, of humiliating her in front of people who mattered, and for the first time I listened to the entire message without reacting emotionally, because it sounded less like anger and more like fear. Fear of irrelevance, fear of losing leverage, fear of realizing that the child she tried to control had outgrown the system entirely. I didn't call her back. I didn't block her either. I let the silence answer for me. My sister withdrew completely, and that hurt more than I expected, not because I wanted her approval, but because it confirmed that she'd benefited from the imbalance long enough that acknowledging it now would require confronting herself. I heard through mutual contacts that her in-laws were keeping their distance, that counseling had been suggested, that conversations about values and boundaries were happening behind closed doors, and while I didn't take any satisfaction in that, I also didn't intervene. This wasn't my mess to clean, and stepping in would only repeat the pattern I was trying to break. Professionally, something unexpected happened around the same time, and it caught me off guard. Several people reached out, not to comment on the wedding or the video, but to ask if I'd be open to stepping into more visible leadership roles. One of them said something I hadn't considered, that the way I handled the situation showed restraint, clarity, and strength under pressure, and that those traits mattered more than charm or compliance. Hearing that reframed everything, because it reminded me that what my family had always framed as stubbornness was actually discernment, and what they called coldness was composure. By the end of that week, the chaos had settled into a new normal, and that normal didn't include me being available on demand or absorbing blame for other people's comfort. I changed the locks not because I was afraid, but because I wanted a physical reminder that access was now intentional. I updated my legal documents, clarified asset protections, and made decisions that prioritized stability over appeasement. None of it felt dramatic, it felt practical, like cleaning up after a storm that had been brewing for years. One night, as I stood in my penthouse looking out over the city lights, I realized something that surprised me. I wasn't angry anymore, not at my parents, not at my sister, not even at the version of myself who stayed quiet for too long. I felt resolved. The kind of resolution that doesn't need validation or closure because it's rooted in self-trust. The wedding had been the spark, but the fire had been waiting, and now that it had burned through the illusions, there was space to build something honest in their place. I knew the story wasn't over yet, because systems like that don't collapse all at once, they unravel slowly, but I also knew that whatever came next, I wouldn't be dragged into it unwillingly again, because the moment I said no out loud in front of everyone, I stopped being the person they could control. By the time the next phase started, it no longer felt like I was reacting to anything. It felt like I was watching a structure collapse under its own weight while standing safely outside the blast radius. That's the part people never tell you about moments like this. Once you stop participating, once you step out of the role assigned to you, the chaos doesn't follow you. It stays with the people who created it. My parents were still scrambling, still calling lawyers, still trying to understand how something they treated as a family matter had turned into a professional and social reckoning. But I wasn't part of those conversations anymore, and that separation was everything. What really made it undeniable was when the business community stopped pretending this was private. Quietly, without announcements, invitations changed. Panels my father had been scheduled to speak on were restructured. Dinners that were once standing engagements were postponed indefinitely. A charity gala he and my mother had chaired for years suddenly had new leadership listed on the website. No explanations were offered. None were needed. In those circles, silence is a verdict. The wedding incident wasn't being discussed as gossip anymore. It was being discussed as a data point, evidence of judgment, temperament, risk. And risk is something investors do not tolerate for long. I heard through Marcus that the board meetings had become tense in a way they'd never been before. Not explosive, not emotional, but cold. Questions were being asked my father wasn't used to answering. Why was there no internal code addressing conflicts of interest within family leadership? Why had there been no intervention earlier? Why had a public incident escalated without immediate damage control? Each question chipped away at the authority he'd relied on for decades. Watching from a distance, I realized something uncomfortable but true. The power he held had always been conditional. It just took a public rupture for everyone to admit it. At the same time, my mother's world was shrinking in a different way. She stopped hosting, stopped being invited. The constant rotation of lunches, events, and social validation she'd built her identity around dried up almost overnight. She reached out once, not to apologize, not to reconcile, but to ask why people weren't calling anymore. That question told me more than any admission ever could. She didn't understand that influence isn't permanent, it's borrowed, and once people see you abuse it, they don't lend it back. My sister remained distant, but fragments of her reality reached me anyway. Counseling sessions that turned uncomfortable. In-laws who started setting boundaries she wasn't used to. Conversations where she was forced to confront the idea that entitlement isn't a substitute for independence. I didn't interfere. I didn't offer advice. This wasn't about punishment. It was about growth, and growth only happens when the safety net is removed. Stepping in would have been easier for me, but easier doesn't mean right. What surprised me most during this period was how my own life expanded without effort. Not dramatically, not overnight, but steadily. People treated me differently now, not because of the penthouse or the video, but because I demonstrated something rare, the ability to say no under pressure and stand by it without theatrics. Doors opened that I hadn't knocked on. Opportunities surfaced that hadn't existed before. One executive told me directly that watching me hold my ground without attacking anyone signaled leadership in a way resumes never could. That comment stayed with me. There were moments, late at night, when the weight of everything would surface unexpectedly. Not regret, but grief for the version of family I'd hoped for but never had. I let myself feel that without trying to fix it. Grief doesn't mean you made the wrong choice. It means you cared. Letting that exist without pulling me backward was part of the process. Then came the call I knew would eventually happen. My father again, this time without pretense. He didn't ask to fix things. He didn't ask for help. He asked what I wanted moving forward. That question, simple as it was, marked the real shift. I told him the truth. I wanted distance, respect, and no more assumptions about access to my life or my assets. I told him reconciliation wasn't off the table, but it wasn't guaranteed either, and it wouldn't happen on his timeline. He accepted that quietly. I don't know if he fully understood it, but he heard it. After that, I felt something settle that I hadn't realized was missing. Finality without bitterness. Clarity without anger. I wasn't waiting for apologies anymore. I wasn't measuring progress by their behavior. I was measuring it by my peace, and my peace was steady. Standing in my penthouse one evening, city lights stretching endlessly below, I thought back to the moment my mother raised her hand. That moment had felt like humiliation then, but now I understood it for what it really was, the last desperate attempt to reassert control when words stopped working. And control, once challenged publicly, rarely survives. The story wasn't finished yet, I knew that. Systems like the one I grew up in don't dissolve quietly. They fray. They resist. They attempt to reassemble themselves in new forms. But whatever came next, I would meet it from a position of strength rather than obligation. Because the truth was simple and irreversible now. I had stepped out of the role they needed me to play for their world to function. And without that role, their world was changing whether they liked it or not. By the time Part 8 began, the fallout had moved past shock and into something far more dangerous for my parents: normalization. People had stopped asking what happened at the wedding and started acting as if the consequences were simply the natural order of things. That's when you know power has truly shifted. Scandals fade when they're treated as accidents. They calcify when they're treated as patterns. And in my family's case, the pattern had become impossible to ignore. What I didn't expect was how many people reached out privately. Not journalists, not clout chasers, but executives, partners, even junior employees from my father's company. Some of them had seen the live stream. Others had only heard whispers. But the message was consistent. We always wondered why you never spoke up. We assumed you were protected because of your position. We didn't realize you were dealing with that. It was unsettling to realize how many people had noticed something was off long before it exploded publicly. Silence, I learned, doesn't mean ignorance. Sometimes it means people are waiting to see who breaks first. Inside the company, the board began restructuring in subtle but unmistakable ways. Committees were formed that had never existed before. Oversight measures were introduced under the language of modern governance. My father still held his title, but titles mean less when every decision has to pass through layers that didn't used to exist. Marcus didn't gloat. He didn't need to. He simply ensured that the systems worked exactly as written. And systems, unlike people, don't bend for family dynamics. At the same time, I was dealing with a different kind of reckoning. For years, I'd calibrated my behavior around not provoking conflict, not correcting narratives, not asserting ownership too loudly. That instinct doesn't disappear overnight. There were moments I caught myself hesitating before making decisions that were unquestionably mine to make. Moments where I almost explained myself unnecessarily. Each time I stopped. Each time, I chose clarity over comfort. It was a muscle I hadn't used before, and it was finally getting stronger. My sister eventually reached out again, not with accusations this time, but with confusion. She didn't understand why people were treating her differently, why invitations had stopped, why her in-laws had gone quiet. She framed it as punishment, as something being done to her. I listened without interrupting. Then I said something I'd never said before. This isn't happening to you. It's happening because of choices made around you. She didn't respond well to that. But truth rarely lands cleanly the first time. What struck me most was how much of my family's influence had been propped up by my compliance, by my silence, by my willingness to absorb discomfort so things looked smooth on the surface. Once that was gone, everything else began to wobble. I wasn't the center of the structure, but I was a key support. Remove the support, and the cracks appear fast. Professionally, things accelerated in ways I couldn't have planned. A global firm reached out about a potential partnership, explicitly referencing how I handled the situation. Not the conflict itself, but the restraint. The lack of public retaliation. The focus on boundaries rather than revenge. That distinction mattered. Anyone can burn bridges. Fewer people can walk away and let the other side collapse under scrutiny. That's what they wanted to align with. There was a moment, weeks later, when I attended an industry event my parents would normally dominate. Same venue, same crowd. This time, they weren't there. I was. Conversations flowed easily. No one tiptoed. No one asked loaded questions. I realized something quietly profound. I wasn't surviving their absence. I was thriving in it. The space they'd occupied wasn't empty. It was lighter. Late one night, I found myself scrolling through old photos. Family holidays. Milestones. Smiles that looked convincing at the time. I didn't feel anger. I felt distance. Emotional distance is different from resentment. Resentment keeps you tied to the past. Distance lets you observe it without being pulled back in. That distinction was the real victory. Then came an unexpected development. A formal inquiry. Not into the wedding, but into my father's company culture. Anonymous complaints. Patterns of favoritism. Internal concerns that had been suppressed for years. The timing wasn't accidental. When leadership credibility cracks, people who've been silent feel safer speaking up. I wasn't involved in initiating any of it, but I wasn't surprised either. Systems that tolerate private abuse often hide public ones too. Marcus called me when the inquiry became official. He didn't ask for advice. He informed me, professionally, because transparency was now the rule. Before hanging up, he said something that stayed with me. This is why boundaries matter. Not just for you, but for everyone watching. He was right. The ripple effect was bigger than my family. It was cultural. My mother tried one last time to regain control, this time through optics. A carefully worded interview. A narrative about misunderstandings and emotions running high. It fell flat. The public had already seen the unfiltered version. Polished revisions don't erase raw footage. When reality exists on video, spin has a short shelf life. I didn't respond publicly. I didn't need to. Silence, when chosen deliberately, is a statement. Every day I didn't engage, the story lost oxygen. People moved on to the next headline. My parents were left managing consequences without a villain to point to. That was the part they couldn't stand. Accountability without confrontation. As Part 8 came to a close, one thing was clear. This wasn't about a penthouse anymore. It was about autonomy. About what happens when someone stops being available for exploitation. About how quickly narratives fall apart when the person they're built on steps out of frame. I wasn't planning revenge. I was building a life that didn't require their approval. And that, more than anything, was proving impossible for them to ignore. By the time Part 9 began, the noise had faded enough that something more unsettling replaced it. A quiet that wasn't peaceful but anticipatory, the kind that comes before systems finally snap. The headlines were gone. The clips had stopped circulating, and yet behind closed doors everything was still moving, still unraveling, just out of public view. That's when the real consequences started, the kind that don't trend but permanently change who holds power and who doesn't. I found out my father had been placed on temporary administrative leave through a third party, not from him, not from my mother, but from a compliance officer who asked if I would be willing to give a statement should it become necessary. The phrasing was careful, neutral, but the implication was obvious. They weren't asking out of courtesy. They were preparing for impact. I told them the truth, that I had no intention of escalating anything, but that I wouldn't lie or soften facts if asked. The officer thanked me and said something that stuck with me. That's all we needed to hear. At the same time, my mother's attempts to regain narrative control became increasingly erratic. She stopped trying to justify the slap and shifted to framing herself as a victim of betrayal, claiming stress, pressure, misunderstanding, anything except responsibility. But the more she spoke, the less sympathy she gained. People don't respond well to denial when evidence exists. Every statement she made contradicted another. Every explanation created new questions. Silence would have served her better, but she's never understood restraint. My sister went completely quiet. No texts, no calls, no indirect messages through relatives. At first I thought she was processing, maybe even reconsidering things. Later, I learned she'd been advised to distance herself while legal and financial matters were reviewed. That advice didn't come from love or loyalty. It came from people who finally saw risk instead of advantage in our family name. When that shift happens, priorities change fast. What surprised me most during that period was my own reaction. I wasn't relieved. I wasn't triumphant. I felt alert, focused, almost clinical. Years of emotional suppression had trained me well for moments like this. I knew not to interfere, not to rescue, not to explain. Letting consequences land is harder than confrontation, especially when you've been conditioned to smooth things over. But I stayed still, and the stillness did more damage than any argument ever could. Then came the first real fracture. One of my father's oldest partners withdrew from a joint venture citing irreconcilable differences in leadership values. That phrase showed up again 2 days later in a separate notice. It wasn't coordinated publicly, but it didn't need to be. Once one person exits, others reassess. Confidence is contagious, but so is doubt, and doubt spreads faster. I received an invitation to a closed-door strategy session with Marcus and 2 board members who wanted my perspective, not because of family ties, but because they needed insight into operational continuity. Sitting in that room, listening to grown men dissect the stability of a company my father once ruled absolutely, I felt something detach inside me. I wasn't his son in that space. I was an asset, a stabilizing factor, a counterweight, and no one questioned it. After the meeting, Marcus pulled me aside and asked a question that caught me off guard. He asked if I was prepared for the possibility that my father might never return to his role. Not suspended, not reassigned, replaced. I told him I wasn't planning for that outcome, but I wasn't afraid of it either. He nodded and said that was the right answer. Leadership, he said, isn't about wanting power. It's about being able to carry it when it lands in your hands without flinching. That night, alone in my penthouse, I replayed the wedding in my head, not the slap, not the whine, but the moment before everything broke, when I still believed saying no would be enough, when I thought boundaries only needed to be stated once. I understood then how naive that was. Boundaries aren't requests. They're positions, and positions invite response. A few days later, an envelope arrived without a return address. Inside was a handwritten note from my father. No accusations, no justifications, just a few lines acknowledging that he underestimated the situation and that things had gone further than he intended. He didn't apologize. He didn't ask forgiveness. But he didn't deny what happened either. That, for him, was as close to accountability as I'd ever seen. I folded the note and placed it in a drawer, not because it meant everything, but because it meant something. The mysterious part wasn't what was happening to them. It was what wasn't happening to me. No retaliation, no backlash, no isolation. If anything, my world expanded. Invitations increased. Trust deepened. People spoke more openly around me. Power doesn't announce itself. It shows up in access, in silence, in the absence of resistance. As part 9 ended, one truth had fully settled in. The wedding wasn't the climax. It was the trigger. Everything after was just gravity doing its job. And gravity doesn't care about intention, only mass. My family had built their authority on control. The moment that control failed publicly, the weight shifted. And once weight shifts, it never returns to where it was. By the time part 10 began, the situation had entered a phase no one in my family knew how to navigate, because it couldn't be shouted down or smoothed over or reframed as a misunderstanding. It was procedural now, and once things become procedural, emotion stops mattering. The internal inquiry into my father's company moved quietly but relentlessly. Interviews scheduled, records requested, decisions made without announcements. This wasn't punishment, it was evaluation, and evaluation is far more dangerous to people who've relied on authority instead of accountability. I stayed deliberately distant from the process, not because I was afraid of the outcome, but because proximity creates assumptions. Every move I made was measured, documented, and boring in the best possible way. I went to work. I handled my responsibilities. I didn't comment publicly. I didn't leak information, and that restraint unsettled people more than any statement could have. When you don't react, others are forced to sit with their own behavior. My mother tried again, this time through intermediaries. A family friend reached out saying she was worried about her mental health, that the stress was overwhelming, that maybe I could help calm things down. I listened, thanked them for their concern, and said gently but firmly that her emotional state was not my responsibility and that any communication should go through appropriate channels. That was the moment I knew I'd changed. Old me would have rushed in to manage the damage. This version of me understood that stepping in would only restart the cycle. Behind the scenes, my sister's marriage began showing cracks. Not dramatic ones, not shouting matches or public scenes, but quiet withdrawals. Dinners canceled, plans postponed. Her husband's family started keeping distance, and it became clear they were reevaluating more than just that night. They'd seen how conflict was handled, how pressure was applied, how boundaries were ignored. Those things don't disappear after vows. They become warning signs. I heard through indirect channels that my father had been advised to take a leave of absence indefinitely while the board assessed long-term leadership options. Indefinitely is a polite word that usually means never. Titles linger longer than influence, but eventually even the title goes when the influence is gone. I didn't feel satisfaction when I heard that. I felt closure. There's a difference. Satisfaction feeds on emotion. Closure is quiet and final. What made this phase strange was how ordinary my days became. No drama, no confrontation, just steady forward motion. I'd wake up, work, come home, look out over the city, and feel grounded. The penthouse stopped being a symbol of conflict and returned to what it was always meant to be, a place of peace. I hadn't realized how much tension I carried until it was gone. Then something unexpected happened. I was asked to step into a temporary advisory role within the company, not because of family ties, but because continuity mattered. The request was formal, documented, and supported by multiple stakeholders. No one mentioned my father. No one referenced the wedding. They spoke only about experience, trust, and stability. I accepted under clear conditions and strict boundaries. I wasn't there to fix what was broken. I was there to ensure nothing else broke. Walking into those meetings felt surreal. People who once deferred automatically to my father now deferred to process, to data, to reason, and occasionally to me. Not because I demanded it, but because I was consistent. Authority built on consistency lasts longer than authority built on fear. My mother stopped trying to contact me altogether after her last attempt failed. Silence from her wasn't peace, but it was distance, and distance was necessary. My sister sent one final message asking if we could talk someday, without lawyers or business or expectations. I didn't reject the idea, but I didn't promise anything either. Healing doesn't happen on demand. It happens when patterns stop repeating. As part 10 came to a close, one thing became clear. The mystery wasn't what would happen to my family's public image or my father's career. That path was already unfolding. The real question was what kind of life I would build now that I was no longer orbiting their gravity. For the first time, my future felt undefined in the best way possible, not shaped by reaction or resistance, but by choice. And that choice, finally, was entirely mine. Everything slowed down after that, but not in a calm way, more like the kind of slow you feel right before something final locks into place. The advisory role I stepped into became heavier than expected, not because of workload, but because of what it symbolized. People watched how I moved, how I spoke, how I handled pressure, not out of suspicion but curiosity. I represented continuity without legacy, stability without entitlement, and that combination made certain people uncomfortable while reassuring others. I could feel the shift in rooms when I entered, conversations adjusting, decisions pausing until I spoke, not because I demanded it, but because my presence had become associated with resolution instead of chaos. The internal review didn't need my input to reach conclusions, but the conclusions echoed things I'd lived with my entire life. Patterns of control, favoritism, emotional decision-making masked as leadership. These weren't new discoveries, they were confirmations. When systems protect power instead of people, cracks form quietly until one public moment exposes everything. That wedding hadn't created the damage. It had simply turned the lights on. I learned my father had been asked to step away from all operational authority pending a full board vote. Not suspended, not demoted, simply removed from daily influence. For a man whose identity was built entirely around command, that was devastating. He didn't reach out. He didn't argue. He disappeared into silence. And for the first time in my life, that silence wasn't aimed at punishing me. It was survival. My mother tried once more, not with anger or manipulation, but with something closer to desperation. A message came through an attorney asking if I would consider a private mediation session. No cameras, no audience, just family. I read it carefully and then declined. Not out of spite, but clarity. Mediation only works when all parties accept the premise that something needs to change. She wanted restoration of control, not repair. I wasn't willing to reopen a door that had taken years to close. The hardest part of this phase wasn't letting go of them. It was letting go of the version of myself that believed reconciliation was always the goal. That belief had kept me small, compliant, and constantly negotiating my worth. Walking away from it felt like grief, not for what I lost, but for how long I'd waited to choose myself. Professionally, momentum continued building in quiet ways. Invitations to speak, requests for collaboration, offers that came without conditions attached. People weren't rewarding me for drama. They were responding to consistency, to boundaries, to the fact that I didn't fold when pressured and didn't retaliate when attacked. That combination is rare, and in certain circles, deeply respected. I ran into my sister's husband at an event weeks later. Alone. He looked tired, distracted, older than I remembered. We exchanged polite words, nothing more. Later I learned the marriage was unraveling, not explosively, but inevitably. Counseling sessions turned into realizations. Expectations surfaced that had never been discussed. My sister had grown up believing access to others' resources was love. He hadn't. That difference matters. One evening, sitting alone in my living room, city lights stretching endlessly beyond the glass, I thought about how close I'd come to giving in at that wedding. How easy it would have been to hand over the keys, smile for photos, absorb the resentment quietly, and maintain the illusion. The cost of that choice would have followed me forever. Instead, I chose discomfort once over resentment for life. The calls eventually stopped. The messages faded. My name stopped being attached to theirs in conversations. People referred to me on my own terms, not as someone's son, not as an extension of a family brand, but as myself. That was the real shift. Not the board decisions or the public fallout, but the quiet redefinition of who I was allowed to be without apology. As this chapter neared its end, I understood something clearly. Closure doesn't always come with forgiveness or reconciliation. Sometimes it comes with distance, acceptance, and the knowledge that you did not abandon anyone. You simply stopped abandoning yourself. The last phase didn't arrive with noise or confrontation. It arrived with certainty. Nothing else needed to happen for the story to be finished because the power dynamics had already shifted beyond repair. My father was officially voted out of his executive role 2 weeks later, not announced with drama, but disclosed in a routine filing that barely made the news cycle. For him, it was the end of a legacy. For the company, it was continuity. For me, it was confirmation that systems eventually correct what individuals refuse to face. My mother never apologized. Not privately, not publicly. She framed the outcome as betrayal until the very end, convinced that authority alone should have protected her. But authority without respect is temporary. She lost influence quietly, socially first, then structurally. Invitations stopped. Phone calls slowed. People who once nodded along to her narrative began keeping distance. Not because of me, but because no one wants to align with instability once it's exposed. My sister and her husband separated shortly after. There was no announcement, no spectacle, just a shift in addresses and an unspoken understanding that something fundamental had been broken before it ever had the chance to stabilize. I didn't feel vindicated by that. I felt resolved. Their choices were their own, just as mine were. For the first time, I wasn't carrying responsibility for outcomes that weren't mine to manage. Professionally, I declined a permanent executive role at my father's former company. That decision surprised some people, but it made perfect sense to me. I didn't need to inherit space that was created through collapse. I built my career by choice, not proximity. Instead, I accepted an expanded role elsewhere, one that came without history attached, where my authority was earned cleanly and without emotional debt. That freedom mattered more than any title. The Penthouse stopped being a symbol altogether. It was just home. Quiet mornings, evenings without tension, a place where no one expected anything from me except authenticity. I changed the locks, not as a statement, but as a formality. Boundaries aren't about punishment. They're about clarity. Months later, Marcus and I had dinner overlooking the city. He raised a glass and said something simple. But the most dangerous thing to people who rely on control is someone who refuses to play the role they were assigned. He wasn't congratulating me. He was acknowledging reality. Once you step out of a system built on entitlement, the system has no leverage left. I didn't lose my family that day at the wedding. I lost an illusion. The belief that love required sacrifice without limits. The belief that silence was strength. The belief that my worth was negotiable. Letting go of those ideas didn't leave a void. It made room. If there's one thing I know now, it's this. Standing up for yourself doesn't always look heroic. Sometimes it looks quiet, controlled, unapologetic. And sometimes the bravest thing you can do is walk away and let consequences speak for you. I didn't choose revenge. I chose autonomy. And in the end, that choice changed everything. What was your favorite moment? Drop it in the comments below, and don't miss more thrilling stories like this. Subscribe and hit that notification bell so you never miss an upload.